I think we're moving people dramatically. But the most interesting phone call that I have heard to a talk radio show occurred yesterday. Wasn't on my show. I was listening to Michael. I was driving to work. And it was troubling, and I didn't hear the answer. It went over break, which means good phone call. Black man called up, and he said, Michael, if you were living in Germany, and a Jewish man won in Germany, president of Germany, and after 2 years, everybody in Germany stopped him, they threw themselves in their way, they did everything they could to beat him. You might remember it better than I did, because I said, wow, and then I had to go upset. What a question. Said you would think it was a conspiracy to destroy that man's presidency. And I'm telling you right now, African Americans believe things have gone on in this country in the last 2 years to destroy this presidency because he's black. How did you answer that? Because that is going to be my heart sunk. Because the one thing I heard you say is a lot of people view the president through a lens of race. I don't. Michael doesn't. I doubt Steve does. I know Denny doesn't. But a lot of people do. And if this becomes the meme that he's failed because of his race as opposed to his terrible policies, we are in for an even worse cycle of bitterness. How did you answer that? How did it go on?
I kept him on for 3 segments.
I'm not
because he was a great,
it was an amazing call.
He's a great caller. I mean, really one of the best callers I've ever had. He was smart, and he was sophisticated, and he knew politics. And he was convinced, completely convinced, that the reason for the opposition to Barack Obama was because he was black. So one of the things I asked him was, I said, well, most Republicans, all Republicans ultimately, opposed Obamacare. Do you think that was because he was black? He said, yes. I said, well, do you think Bill Clinton was really black? I mean, we opposed Hillary care, was the same thing. And the opposition was even more fervent, and that opposition was successful. And he said, well, yeah, but this is different. And you see, what is different here, and it's so important, I mean, we went on and back and forth, and one of the points that I made is I said, look, if you're telling me that 90% of Germany would turn against this first Jewish chancellor, that would be evidence of anti-Semitism. What happened to the anti-Semitism when he got elected, right? The point is, when Obama got elected, he got elected with overwhelming confidence of the American people. He won a big electoral victory. And he started out with some of the highest approval ratings of any new president. If you go back to John Kennedy to find higher approval ratings for any new president coming in. And after his inauguration address and the inauguration with those hundreds of thousands of people, he was sky high. And it has not had anything to do with race that people turned against him. Now, this is important to remember. Barack Obama, in the new Gallup numbers, has an approval rating among white Americans of 36%. Among black Americans, 91%. McCain won the white vote by 12 points. I don't think that was because of racism. I think that's because the white voters were looking at it in a less racial lens. But it's one of those realities that we have to deal with. This election will be won and lost by making inroads in communities.
When I deal with issues about radical Islam, and I always make the point that, because first of all, we have 5 Muslims on our staff, and they understand the threat, and they are genuinely moderate, but they have families. And I understand the whole problem. It's a tragedy for Islam that the moderates don't have the money, the venue, the strength to emerge, because you stick your neck out of the foxhole, you get shot at. And we want to empower them. And so I always make the distinction between radical Islam and moderate Islam. And we have to make that distinction. And those people who sort of clog on, like the pastor in Gainesville was going to burn a Quran, I mean, that just does enormous damage to the whole notion of opposition to radical Islam, because the radical Muslims say, you see, it's all the opponents to Islam are racists, and they're engaged in this outrageous behavior. And the reality is, unfortunately, that 70 to 80% of the mosques in the United States are controlled by the radicals. Time magazine is America Islamophobic. I mean, what's the definition of the term Islamophobia? It's an irrational fear of Muslims. And I would say to you that because 80% of international terrorist attacks by religious groups in the last decade have been carried out by radical Muslims, there is a rational fear that I would not like to see in evidence, but it exists. It's the same fear that those passengers on the Minneapolis plane reported to the pilots when they saw 6 Muslims acting suspiciously. They were doing the right thing. They weren't bigots. And the Islamic groups will throw that term at everybody. And we want to be able to show that we're not bigots. So we want to be able to show that we empower genuine moderate Muslims like Zuhdi Jasser from Phoenix, Arizona, or Hadiya Maramati from California, from the Islamic Supreme Council. Sue Myrick, a wonderful lady, a congresswoman from Charlotte, North Carolina, just had a panel last Friday of moderate Muslims who were wonderful. I mean, we have the videotape on our website. They want to confuse the distinction between radical Islam and Islam. They want to hide. They say that anybody who criticizes radical Islam is a bigot, which is bull, something. And we don't want them to give. We don't want to give them any evidence of that. And so, I think the American public understands this, and I also think the American public is not Islamophobic. I think the American public is eminently fair in light of the fact that 3,000 people were killed just 9 years ago, and that there have been 139 plots since then. You only have a third of the American public that expresses in public opinion polls that they have a suspicion of Islam. That's, I think, an amazing statistic, because in European polls, you have much larger numbers, numbers that, by the way, result in elections that bar the building of minarets, or elect very right-of-center parties that sometimes border on bigotry. But they are a reaction to what's going on in Europe, which is much worse than what's going on here. So ultimately, we have to fight the good war, fight it fairly, ignore what the bad guys say about us, because they're going to throw the terms at us no matter what. Don't give them any ammunition whatsoever, because we have the evidence on our side.